Well, welcome back to another episode, special Christmas episode as part of our series called With Great Expectation, Finding Hope, Peace, Joy, and Love this Advent season. And in this episode, we'll be journeying through Psalm 37 as we reflect on brokenness and hope and peace in a world longing for justice. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So let me introduce you to our very special guest that I've been just waiting to talk with, Natasha Sistrunk Robinson. Now, Natasha is president of T3 Leadership Solutions, Inc., and founder and chair of Leadership Links, Incorporated. She's a sought-after international speaker, leadership coach, and consultant with more than 20 years of leadership experience in the military, federal government, academic, and nonprofit sectors. She's a former U.S. Marine Corps officer and federal employee at the Department of Homeland Security, and she's the author of several books, including Journey to Freedom, A Sojourner's Truth, Hope for Us, Knowing God Through the Nicene Creed, Mentor for Life. She hosts a Sojourner's Truth podcast, and she's the editor and author of Voices of Lament, this book right here, Reflections on Brokenness and Hope in a World Longing for Justice. Welcome, Natasha, to See Hear Love.
Thank you so much for having me, Melinda. I'm glad to be with you today.
Well, before we talk about your latest book, and I've got lots of thoughts and questions for you, and because it's Christmas, Natasha, which I just love, I want to ask you two questions that I've been asking everybody that's part of this the series. But number one, Natasha, your favorite part or moment of the Christmas story, and why? Thinking of the whole Christmas story and the narrative, what's your favorite moment within it?
I've been reflecting on that this morning, even as I was doing my morning devotion. And honestly, I think it changes, from year to year, depending on what season you're in. But I've already started kind of my Advent reading. I'm going to read through the Gospel of Luke this season. And starting that, I just remember, when the shepherds were coming and how they spoke about the baby that is Jesus. And in Luke, this is one verse. It says in Luke, this is verse 19 out of chapter 2. And it says that Mary treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart. And it's a small verse, but as a mother and as someone who is, I think, hopeful about the future, but also really challenged by the present moment, and knowing what it's like to have carried a child and lost a child, and carried a child and birthed a child, there is great anticipation, and there's a lot of anxiety, and this was no ordinary child. And so to have outsiders be brought into something that's very intimate and sacred and special, and seeing something that as a young girl, you might not even know the significance of it yet. That just, I don't know, that just sat differently with me this time on reading it, that she just pondered it and treasured it in her heart. And I think that too, the pondering, the unknowing, the wonder, the mystery, is a blessing and a sacredness and a being fully present and intimate with God.
That is beautiful. I need to think through that one. I haven't really thought through that. And I think what's really good about that, Natasha, is that in our society, I found, and culture, we don't like the mystery and pondering and not knowing. We want the resolve. We want the happy ending. We want to know what is going to happen and how it will happen, when it will happen, and that it will end well and good, and that's how it's going to be. So those words, mystery, pondering, sitting in that moment, I think for a lot of people it's like it seems unfamiliar or uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And I think from the very beginning, you just go over a few verses and they're, Jesus is born. They take Jesus to the temple, and the prophetess Anna basically speaks, she's prophesies over his life. And I think at a very early age, you have all this love and hope and anticipation for a child. But when you really think about it, her heart was grieved from the beginning because she knew what was going to be. I don't think she understood the full extent, but she had some idea of what this life was going to require of him, and therefore what she would have to journey through and experience as a mother. And that's a lot to carry for anybody, but I think certainly for a young girl, that love that you would have for any child that you birth in a healthy relationship, in a loving environment, and then this grief, this anxiety, this fear even of, oh my God, like what is, like literally, God, what is his life gonna be like?
Gosh, I can't even imagine that.
Right.
Wow, that's good. Wow, I love that. I'm gonna look that over again too. And I think that what you're really saying, I'm hearing is, I think when we reread the story again, to kind of pause on this, because sometimes you just sort of read it to get through it, right? It's Christmas, we kind of read it, get through it, we know the story. But moments like this to kind of ponder ourselves on the significance, the weight, is good. That's good. Thank you, Natasha. That's great. Okay, second question. What are your thoughts about our anchor quote for our Advent series and focusing on peace? And it comes from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This is what he says. The celebration of Advent is possible only to those who are troubled in soul, who know themselves to be poor and imperfect, and who look forward to something greater to come.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love him, by the way. I just recorded that I'm only doing one episode for Advent on my blog, on my podcast this season. I just recorded it yesterday. And this season, we're talking about grief. The whole season is on grief. So I hashtag it grief and. And so that particular episode, I called it Grief and Advent. And what I was saying was, when you think about the liturgical calendar, a lot of time people associate grief with like Lent. And what I said, and I think what this quote is getting at, is that, but Advent is also a moment to grieve as well, because the reality that the world was so bad, that there was so much sin, that we had fallen so far and had really separated ourselves from God so much, that a perfect sacrifice of God's own Son was required, is worthy of grief. And so I think what Dietrich is saying is, we have to deal with the reality of why Jesus had to come as a God man to rescue us from ourselves in the first place, before we can get to the place of rejoicing that God is Emmanuel, present with us.
Yeah. Whew. And again, we kind of jump over that to get to Christmas, right? Like, yay!
Right.
Glory to God in the highest. Woo! You know what I mean?
Right.
Really. All of our plays, all of that.
Yeah.
Because again, who wants to sit in the grief and brokenness, lament, and that during a season that is been positioned and postured as this fun, jolly Christmas. And today it's snowing here in Canada, just so you know. I'm looking over it.
Already, yes.
Falling. So you know what I'm saying? Like, it's that kind of thing. But you're right. I think that part of, in the grief of understanding just the weight of that. And
this is the thing too, like reading this morning and thinking about what you're saying, and I think it's going to help us even as we go and talk about voices of lament. What the prophet Isaiah said about Jesus. So I was looking at this again this morning in chapter 9, verses 6 through 7 there, and he says, "For unto us a child is born." We love these scriptures, but really think about the words. "Unto us a child is born, to us a son is given," and watch the systemic injustice. "The government will be on his shoulders." So that means there's things wrong in the government that Jesus, this child, is going to make right. The government will be on his shoulders. He will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. and this is the acts of justice again. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. And so, when I hear that prophetic word from the prophet Isaiah, I'm reminded, it's very clear to me, like, Jesus did come for our personal salvation, and not exclusively for our personal salvation.
Yes.
Like, Jesus came to make all things that are wrong right in the world. It's a new order. It's a new order in which Jesus is king, and he's going to establish his throne of righteousness and justice, right? Which tells us that there's systemic issues in our world, not just individual personal sins, which are part of it. It informs our systems, right? Our individual personal sins informs our systems, but Jesus is going to address those as well. And so I think so much of how we talk about salvation in the West is absent of the understanding that Jesus cares about your personal salvation and your personal piety. And Jesus cares about all of the injustice and brokenness in the world. Indeed, all of creation groans, the Bible tells us, right? Again, as a result of our abuse and our sin. And so Jesus cares about all of it. And when Jesus came to us in human form, it was to start the whole process, or continue, I would say, the whole process of the perfecting what God intended from the very beginning.
Yes. And that's good news.
And that, my sister, is the gospel. And it is good news.
Good news. Yes.
It is good news.
Yes. Amazing. There it is. All right. Well, that was enough. Thank you for joining me, Natasha. Listen, in that, let's just segue in. So I read through your book. You edited, author in it, Voices of Lament. What a powerful book. And you know what? It's my heart, Natasha, because bringing women together, I mean, that's what the show See Here Love has been. It's always been. You've already said, Melinda, this is a great opportunity for you when I started, for you to kind of build your brand, be that next. And it was really clear to me that God was like, actually, I'm entrusting you with this platform, Melinda, so that you will then bring women in all diversity and stages, ages, thoughts together so they can share their story and their thoughts. Like, it never was mine. It was never. And so when I look at this book, it's that same thing of this collaboration of voices in different styles, which is amazing. And poems and stories and essays and teachings. And so I'm like, it resonated so deeply with me, because this is my heart of hearing all the voices of women collectively together and the power of that. It was amazing. So love it. But why this book now? I know that this was written through pandemic. Like, I think it started, it was through it. So there was some threads of context within that and mentioning that. But how did this come about, and why now for this book, Voices of Lament?
Yeah, that's a common question. And I just, the seed of it really just came out of my own personal, like, my Bible reading time. I try to read through large passages of the Bible, throughout the year. And so at that particular time, I was reading through the book of Jeremiah, and Jeremiah is kind of hard reading, so I was like marrying that with Psalms. And so I mean, really. And so landed on Jeremiah chapter 9, and it, God tells the prophet to call for the wailing women, to wail all over them. And so they're talking about God's people going into exile because of their covenant infidelity and their sin. And so because of that, the women are to wail. And he's telling them, he's telling the prophet specifically why they're wailing. They're wailing because the men have been taken out of the public square, the children have been taken out of the streets, and death has climbed in through their windows. And so I don't know a better metaphor when I think about that latter statement of death being a thief, right? The Bible talks about death as an enemy to us. And so there's going to be a lot of death and consequences, because the Bible is also very clear that the wages of sin is death. And when we have so much darkness and destruction and death, and things are not as they should be, as in children are not playing in the streets because it's not safe. Men are not in a public square because, they're enslaved, or they're in jail, or, they don't, for whatever reason, they're not at work in the marketplace. And so, I thought about all that. And so, of course, I, as a Black woman in the United States, I see all of the ways that the children in my community have been assaulted violently, the men in our community. This was right around the time of the global uprising because of another police brutality that led to the murder of George Floyd. So all these things were happening at the same time of the pandemic. We're losing thousands of lives across the world a day. And so I think I had already crossed the 1 million mark by the time that we had started writing. So that death, it was a thief to us. It was very close. We had people in the writing community that were losing family members to COVID, but some of them were dying for other reasons as well. And so, I was reading all that, and this idea that these women were called, who were most likely professional mourners, and they were called to lead a community. The passages go on to say, to teach your daughters how to wail, teach us a lament. So like the women were leading in their wailing. And the Bible, God, the prophet, doesn't speak to that as being emotional or insignificant. It's like, this is very intentional. Like, these are the people you call because they know what they're doing. And they're going to be the people to teach us because they know what they're doing. And so I was wrestling with that at a time when I'm seeing a church struggling for relevance after a pandemic because they didn't know what they were doing, right? Because this is something that we had never done before. And, I remember someone asking me, it's kind of like what you said about your ministry and your platform and your call. It's like, Natasha, what are you going to do? Somebody who didn't know me well. I said, I'm going to keep doing what I've always been doing. I'm discipling people. I'm teaching. I'm writing. I'm doing the work that God has called me to do. Like, that doesn't change because I've been on mission before this crisis came. And I think a lot of churches, we were doing church, but we had lost sight of mission. And the primary mission we have is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And so I'm like, if you were doing that, then you will find ways to continue to do that. But I don't think that was necessarily posturing of a lot of our churches. And that was a source of lament for me. And what I saw happening with the children, we had children out of school, we had children who were not eating, we had children who weren't getting educated, we had children struggling with mental health. Like, all of those things were kind of grieving my heart. And at the same time, I'm reading through Psalms. And so I land on Psalm 37. And it talks clearly, going back to systemic injustice, about how God deals with the wicked and how God deals with the righteous. And so, in our country, we also had political unrest. We had a lot of narratives being told about people of color in particular that were not true. And that has caused a great source of division in our country. And again, for me as a Black woman from the South, that's not new to me, but it was, I think, new to this younger generation at a level that they had not personally experienced before. And I think the way that it was done so publicly, so it wasn't like the elephant in the room that no one was talking about. I mean, it was like blatant racism and violence, and that was happening not just to Black people. We started seeing it happening to people in the Asian American community, like the way that they name, it was like the Chinese virus, and we saw an increase in violence all across our country to elderly who were in the Asian American community, and women, and sometimes children, and so we were grieving about all these things. And so, all that to say, we were not lost for material to write about. There were a lot of things that caused us to wail.
There was no issue about content.
Right, we were not lost.
We had lots of content.
We had lots of content. Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting because, through the pandemic, I did a podcast with a number of Asian women and men as we saw the rise of Asian hate. Yep. And it's interesting because of particular people saying it was a, Chinese virus, and then people looking at, like, I'm Filipino, So the Filipinos were at fault, and Asia, and then Chinese were at fault, and then Koreans were at fault. Anybody that was Asian was somehow at fault for the pandemic.
Yep.
And we saw that in Canada too. So we had a big conversation for that, and just the grief of our own family, and just even fear for us.
Absolutely.
Walking down the street because you didn't know if somebody was going to push you in front of the bus.
Yep.
Because they were mad that you were the one who started the entire global pandemic. You alone.
Right.
So yeah, it was scary. It was hard. And so obviously that makes sense. The content, you're like, okay, I'm a writer. I can rally these women together. How did you get all the women together? This one is fascinating because they are very diverse. All across, like
intentionally so.
Yeah, which is amazing. How did you sort of gather all of them and said, let's all write a chapter or a part of this, and collectively let's do this?
So there's 29 of us total. About half of them I had personal relationship with beforehand,
nice.
And then I had several other women of color that I had a personal relationship with that I invited, but for whatever reason their schedules didn't allow. They had other commitments, and so I asked them for referrals. And so it was important to me to have about equal I wanted this to be a representation of, when I think about Revelations, that worshiping around the throne of the Lamb will be people from every language and tribe and nation and people group. And I wanted that to be a physically represented in this project. And so for me, I was very clear, like I wanted about equal representation. I wanted equity in the project. And so if I asked a friend, say for example, that was Asian American, and she wasn't available, which was the case for several of them, then I replaced her, or asked her for a referral for another Asian American woman. I didn't replace her with a Latina woman or a Hispanic woman or a Black woman. I asked her for a replacement for another Asian American woman. And so a lot of those, about half of them were referred to me on the project by people that I knew or trusted. And so over the course of the writing for 2 years, more than half of those women, of course, have now become friends. And so I was very intentional in that way about how I wanted equity to be visible on the project by racial and ethnic representation, but also because I wanted to have the diversity of where these women were living geographically and serving, like how they led in different spaces. That was important to me to have that diversity as well. And then finally, I wanted the diversity of people who had a platform and those who didn't. That was important for me as well. And so about half of them have some kind of platform. They're known for writing or speaking or leading an organization or pastoring or whatever. And some of them are less known, but I knew they were theologically sound. They had the pulse of their community, like they will be the trusted women that their communities will call to well, and that they love the Lord, they love the book, and then they would take the project seriously, and their stories and who they represented was worthy of sharing in a project like this.
Yeah, amazing. Natasha Morrison, who did your foreword, says, this book is an anthem of the power of Indigenous, Black, Asian, and Latina women, and indeed women of color across the world. It is a gift to each of us and a reminder, I love this, that we are still here standing, fighting for justice, speaking the truth, and purposing to hope for such a time as this. Our strength and resolve have been initiated by God, inspired by our ancestors, and supported by the women who continue to influence us.
Amen.
It's like, yes.
Amen.
Yes. I mean, again, I could go on. I kind of underlined and wrote in there, though in the book, but it was like, we're standing here and we're fighting for justice. And so when I read that, as I started reading the book, I'm like, okay, that kind of sets the tone of what this is. Let's go through this, Natasha, a little bit, because it's broken into different, so just so the listener can understand this, and I'm going to read some parts that I just want you to, but it's broken into different sections, and what I love is that you went through basically all of Psalm 37 and broke it down, and then had people write through it, and then featuring our ancestors in these stories of women I had never heard of.
Yes.
It's so inspiring for me, because I'm like, and then I would Google them further because I wanted to read more, and I was like, that is, and the one that really stood out, I wanted to say this before we go into, but was Pandita Ramabai.
Uh-huh.
On page 136, she was the younger that was married at 5 years old and then widowed at 12.
Mm-hmm.
Realized, basically, I mean, this is the plight, her life, and then formed these places for widowed women who would be marginalized and at the fringe of society in India. I think it's India.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I read it and I was like, what?
Yeah.
Wow. And it was like every time you featured a story of a woman,
Mm-hmm.
it was like, wow, this is and like I love it, the ancestors, the women that have gone before us, paving the way for women like you and me to be doing what we do. Come on, like it actually.
Yes.
Listen, the women you got were incredibly inspiring, but the stories of the women of our
Yes.
ancestors before were just
Yes.
like inspired me. Like I was just reading and soaking it up. Like it's powerful to remember. I remember to pray for their continuing influence in the world today, because some of the work continues. Those were powerful stories. Thank you for adding those in.
Yeah,
Like,
that was extremely important. So you have to understand that I was writing 2 books at the same time. So people's like, what were you doing in the pandemic? I was writing like a mad person. I mean, I was writing 2 books and I was doing doctorate work. Okay. And so I'm writing this book at the same time I'm writing my Exodus Bible study, which is called A Journey to Freedom. Okay. And so I'm thinking about, and as I'm writing my Exodus work, God introducing himself to Moses at the burning bush as, when they said, who should I say sent you? Or what if they ask me who you are? And, he says, I am. But then he also says, I'm the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And of course, God would not have introduced himself that way to Moses if Moses didn't know who Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was. So, you kind of start there. But then also, when you realize when God starts this whole Exodus and the Israelites are heading out of Egypt, what God starts to do is that he starts to not just give them law. That's one thing that God does, but God gives them spiritual rhythms of celebration. So you get all these festivals that are happening. And when these festivals are happening, what God says is you are to call the men, the women, the children, and the foreigners living among you. And then you take these opportunities to pause, to take Sabbath, to prepare, to feast, and you tell stories. And part of the stories that you tell these people, so they don't forget, because remembering is a spiritual discipline, is who God is. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. Right? You cannot give that credit to anyone or anything else. I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. And you do this multiple times of the year at these festivals, and you do it year after year after year after year, so the people don't forget. And so a part of how the story of faith, the faith itself, who God is passed down to our generations, to children. It's us just gathering, feasting, fellowshipping, and telling them about who God is. And I think we failed our children in that regard in the West. We just haven't done that well. And so I think that's part of it. What was motivating me to include this special element in the book. The other part was, thinking about the words of Pharaoh, these things you mentioned earlier, as in our Bible reading, we just kind of read and gloss over. But when Moses first goes to Pharaoh, he doesn't go to ask Pharaoh to let us go indefinitely, which we know is going to get to that point. But the first request is, let us go worship God in the wilderness for 3 days. And we're going to take everyone, and we're going to take our animals, because we don't know what the sacrifice that God is going to require. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and he asks, and Pharaoh denies and denies and denies. But one of the things that Pharaoh says is, the reason you're asking them to go and the reason they are crying out is because they're lazy. So he crafts this narrative about the Israelites being lazy. But what we know from the text is that, one, they have already built 2 cities for him. So that's not what lazy people do. And 2, that they have been violently oppressed. So even when he starts taking their supplies away, he still has the same quotas for them, and they don't meet it, but they try really hard to, right? And so they're not lazy, but that helped me understand the power that Pharaoh has. Not that I didn't know before, but these are things I'm kind of leaning into in my writing. The power that Pharaoh has to name and the power that Pharaoh has to craft narrative about the other. And so I just think it's extremely important, and I wrote about this in my memoir, Sojourner's Truth, for people of color to have, to be empowered, emboldened, to tell the truth about themselves and their people, and to write their own stories, and to tell the stories about our ancestors. Because we think about history, there's this whole conversation in the United States right now about the education that our children are getting in schools, the books that are being banned, the books that are not being allowed, and this whole, thing about critical race theory. And the bottom line is, to some degree, we just don't want to teach the truth about our history, because part of it is embarrassing. It is embarrassing. And yet the Bible tells us that the truth indeed sets us free. And so my premise, as I ask these women to share and write about Psalm 37, it's like, I want you to tell us not just about your personal testimony. There is power and importance in that. The Bible says in Revelation, they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the power of testimony. So there's power in that single testimony. But I said, but tell me how God has been faithful to your people, because that's a narrative and that's the truth. And tell me about a woman from your people group that embodies the passage, that embodies these verses that you're writing about, because I wanted their names and their stories to be remembered. And I wanted this to be something that we could pass on. Again, teach your daughters how to wail, that we can pass on to our children. And our children can know the names of these women, and they would do exactly what you did. I'm going to go and find out more about her. I'm going to go find out more about her work. I'm going to continue and walk in the vein of in the spirit of this woman who is embodied, whatever the pastor says, blamelessness or righteousness or feeding the hungry or whatever. That to me, that is the work of the ministry, that this is not just a book to me.
Yeah. And I could tell, like, this is, I mean, I'll be honest, here's what happened. So I'm reading these stories. I'm reading, the laments, and then I get to these stories of women, and there was a part of me, Natasha, honestly, where I felt, how come I didn't know about them? There's a part of me that was like, how come I didn't know about them? Which then internally got me, like, upset. Like, it actually, I was like, what's this feeling me that I'm really upset that I didn't know about comfort women in the Japanese army, and this woman stands up and then opens up the floodgates of truth, and like and I remember sitting there reading through this, and I said to my husband, I was telling him some stories, I'm like, I had no idea, so I was upset. But then I was like, wait a second, and what you're saying is resonating, and it's what I thought, because I'm like, I need to continue some of these stories. I actually wrote down, who is the woman from the Philippines that needs to be reminded, written about some of the work that some of these Filipino women have done that I don't even know, that I think I need to take some time to research and bring to light. So what this has done has just been brought up, these things as a woman, and for me going, I'm about championing other women, but reminding people of women in the past who've done amazing work that we don't know or have forgotten. Incredible. Oh, yeah. Loved it. Love it. So good. Let me talk through some of the pieces that came to me. So I'm looking at this, and at first you can go, whoa, Voices of Lament, Reflections. There's a lot. Where do I even begin? And for me, I read right through it. I think for some people it might be like slow, easy. Yeah. For me, I'm more like, I want to read through this, and I didn't stop, but I just kept going. But I believe that it might be even better to do it slow, stop at one, think about it, underline, go back, reflection, prayer, journal, read the story. You know what I mean? Like, really, this could be almost like a devotional type thing to really walk it through, which was really powerful. But some of the things that were so fascinating to me, and as a woman, in page 77, there was this thought about anger, because you're talking about wailing and lament. And then I read through Psalm 37 again, which I hadn't done, again, thank you, Natasha, in a long time, revisiting scriptures and reading it through the lens of the book, of what in the spirit and heart and mission of the book was, and so saw that verse in Psalm 37 differently. But in page 77, it's about anger. And for a lot of women I know, anger is not an emotion that we were ever encouraged to show, demonstrate, speak about within church as a woman, culturally.
Yes.
And on page 77, it says, I believe that the full intention of the psalmist is to name our anger, to invite community into our healing and desires for justice, and then to leave anger behind as we lean into the promises of God, who is the God of comfort and giver of peace that surpasses all our understanding. And I was like, because I was, it's one of those things is that, oh my goodness, can we be angry?
Yes.
Are we allowed to show anger? Because,
Yeah.
A lot of us, and I know a lot has come up in many of my conversations on my show about culturally that emotion. And then what happens is later on in life, it actually has caused some major issues, deep issues, because we have not shown anger, felt anger, because we were not allowed to or told not to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to speak this out, it's like permission. You're giving us permission.
Yeah. No, my friend Kathy Kong wrote that piece. She's Korean American, and then one of our other Korean American sisters, Tasha Young, wrote a poem for the book, and the title is "Anger, I Will Not Tame Her." And so, to your point, there are cultural elements for that as well. And I think that, first of all, we're fully human people, which means that we have the ability to experience the breadth of our emotions. And I think a lot of times in church, we are not encouraged to be honest about that.
Yes.
When I was writing my memoir, Sojourner's Truth, I wrote a whole chapter about anger. And even because I said, there's an anger that's righteous as well. And one thing I write about with Moses is like, Moses has a righteous anger. When you look at his full story, he's angry about a lot of things. And they're all the right things. He's angry when Israel is sinning against God. He's angry when Pharaoh disobeys God and hardens his heart. He's angry when, the shepherds are denying the women from getting the water at the well when he flees Egypt. So he's angry about all the right things. The problem is, though, that because he doesn't deal with that righteous anger, the anger ends up bubbling up into violence. As we saw, he's angry with the Egyptian beating the Israelite, which is a righteous anger. He should be angry about that, but it bubbles up into violence. And so, even one of the questions I was wrestling with in the chapter, like the whole chapter I wrote on anger, is not just what do we do with our anger, which I think is an important question, but also I heard a activist speak at Duke University seminary one time, and he said, like, do we even have a right to be violent? And I don't endorse violence at all. And I look at the Bible, there's a lot of violence, right? And so, and I think even when I look at, we talk about Advent, but even as I look at, the cross, that's a violent act.
Yes.
It's a very violent act, right? That was reserved for criminals. And so I think, we need to wrestle with when there's a righteous anger, what is the appropriate and godly response to that anger? How do we hold space for people to be honest and share and get help even to process and work through that anger together? And I think that's what partially what the testimony of saints does. I think that's partially what the safety of community does, that you can be somewhere that's psychologically safe and loving and affirming and full of faith and be honest that, and yell and be honest and wail and cry about the injustice that you see happening and not feel like you sin, because the Bible says be angry and sin not. So there's a way to be angry and not have that anger lead us into sin.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think just to have the discussion of anger. So
yes,
it's easier for our listeners and viewers to say, you can read through this a little bit more, because again, reading this slowly, your book, to think through this. Like, where am I angry? Righteous anger, and finding, in the safety and places for discussion and whatnot. But I think it was just good, the emotion to identify, because a lot of times there has been, like I said, culturally, and for women, if you're angry, then we're branded something, even though it could be righteous anger of injustice that we see, and then people make assumptions about us.
Yes.
It's not being assertive or being like, we're seeing this for what it is. It's like, you're emotional.
You're the problem.
You've got a problem. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Amazing. It's so good. Okay. Next one I love. Page 130 and 131. There is nothing more gut-wrenching than the wicked prospering on this earth. In our world, corruption is rampant. Evil such as racism and systemic injustice thrive. And the gap between dominant and subdominant cultures continues to widen, and the poor and the marginalized and the hurting are helplessly trapped by schemes and false promises. And then it goes on. In fact, the wicked are thriving at the expense of the righteous.
Mm-hmm.
And the response of God's people is to question God's sovereignty. Is he even control? It's not fair. That one's fascinating to me because that comes up a lot. Like, and through the book, it's like, you know, we're lamenting, but it's like, you know, God, you say the wicked will fall, they'll be wiped out. But from my perspective,
it looks like they're winning. They're winning.
Prospering, successful, money.
Listen.
You know what I'm saying? And you're like, so unfair. We're working hard for, you know, what you are about, God, and for your people. And then all the other people seem to be successful. Yeah. And that's something, I mean, that's, I know. But I'm
it is the lament of my life. It is the lament. Let me tell you, I was reading some of Henry Nouwen the other day.
Yes.
Love him.
Yeah.
And he has a book on prayer. And so I'm gonna share this prayer with you because I'm gonna tell you because of how convicting it was. So it says the prayer of conviction, which is also I'm saying it's my prayer of conviction and confession.
Okay.
And so it's from his book called With Open Hands, Henry Nouwen. It says, you feel bitter because people weren't grateful for something you gave them. You still feel jealous of those who are better paid than you are. You still want to take revenge on someone who didn't respect you. You are still disappointed that you've received no letter, still angry because someone didn't see you walk by. You live through it. You live along with it as though it doesn't really bother you until the moment when you want to pray, and then everything returns. The bitterness, the hate, the jealousy, the disappointment, the desire for revenge. But these feelings are not just there. You clutch them in your hands as if they are treasures that you don't want to let go. You sit wallowing in all the old sourness as if you couldn't do without them, as if in giving them up, you will lose your very self. And I'm like, if this priest ain't just, you know, I was like, Lord have mercy on me, a sinner. Because what he's speaking about, right? The bitterness that can set in because what started as a righteous anger, God, and a righteous lament and wail, God, the wicked, it seems as if the wicked are prospering, right? And that's what it looks like. However you would measure success by the world's standards, which we know is not God's standards. But what we see with our eyes, that's what it looks like. And so it starts out as a righteous lament. But then there's a resentment of God. We out here doing what you told us to do, right? We're trying to be faithful and obedient. And for real, God, why it has to be this hard? Can we get a little bit so the burden and the weight doesn't feel so hard? And so that resentment kicks in and can turn to bitterness because you see them getting so much for doing so little and not even honoring the Lord. And you're out here trying to honor the Lord and do things with integrity and respond to injustice with righteousness and love and truth and care in community. And you're like, God, can I get a little help? And so that's the thing. And so these are hard issues for us, right? And we do need to confess. And I think it's also a matter of us about trust, you know. I think it's a matter of, you know, perspective. This is one thing, going back to your question about Advent, you know, why I think it's important for us to have a kingdom theology, right? That things are not always as they seem, you know, and there's Psalms that are written, you know, in our good book that tells us this is what you see happening with the wicked. I know what it looks like, but let me tell you what their end is going to be. And here's the thing, we don't want that end.
Yeah.
And so part of our hope and part of our joy and part of the peace is that we know what the end of the story is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not going to have the same end.
Yes. And I think we have to remember that in the time where we're sitting going, you walked by and didn't notice me. You know what I mean? As I'm listening to the prayer, you didn't, and then you didn't, and then I didn't, and I didn't get. Yeah, it's good, and I'm so glad that that was in the book, as I'm underlining, and then I'm exclamation pointing on the margin, and then I'm underlining a bit more. So that's a good one. That was really good. I love that you added that in, and then right after was Pandita Ramabai, who I said a woman who stared wickedness in the face.
Yes. And
that's that story is unbelievable, and her forming the Sharada Sadhan Home of Learning in Bombay, amazing. All right, next one, page 181, the Peacemaker. Since we are talking about peace, this one was really powerful when I read this as I was going through, and again I'm going back through this again because I was kind of reading it, and I was like sort of reading it almost like a novel, and then I was like, okay, I think I need to pause on some of these. But the Peacemaker with Carolina. 181. The promise of freedom doesn't lie. This is so interesting. I love it. On paved streets. Freedom comes from our relationship with our Maker, a dance we choreograph together, in each motion a rhythm toward peace. The making is an undoing with a throat full of heart and ancestors. When the making is a stone you fling at a giant, the empire falls. When the making is a song you pen, in darkness the sky opens. Toward the peacemaker's lot, a community in making, we till new life, loosen the hardened earth within ourselves, hips crested, made ready for the water. Oh, I get chills. Hands made ready for the revival.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I you know what I love about Carolina, and how she wrote here. So, I mean, I had a whole vision for the project of how it would be presented and how it could be received well. And for me, part of that was in the art that we incorporated in it. And so, and I include the poetry in the art. But you also know, because we have illustrations in it. And so I think about the metaphors that she shares here about dancing, about singing songs, so music, about one of your topics, doing things in community, like what we make or create in community. The hips crested, to me, that's like even giving birth, right? Like even just all the ways we create. And so I think that a lot of times we think about the pursuit of justice, we're talking about, or we're thinking about reactive work, like how do we respond to something that is wrong in the world. And what I love about art, and what I love about what she's sharing here, these metaphors she's giving us, in the beginning, God reveals himself to us first as creator. God creates something out of nothing, and he says it's good, and indeed by the very end he says it's very good. And so there's something redemptive, I think, about creating, and I think there's something redemptive about and beautiful about art. And I think when we have particularly people of color and people from marginalized groups that are operating in their creative calling, meaning it's one of the ways that we bear God's image, the ability to create and to create beauty, I think is important too. And so when they're operating in that, I think there's something very, very redemptive about that. And I think it's also very much tied to our pursuit of justice. And I like to quote Harry Belafonte when he says, when the movement is strong, the music is strong. And I see that, like art, it could be graffiti, it can be murals on buildings, it can be songs, it can be drums, it can be dancing, it could be great, creating food in the kitchen, like culinary arts. Like there's all kinds of ways when we are embracing art and the beauty of art and the beauty of creation, that we are actually bearing God's image, and it brings light, and it does make this advocacy and this pursuit of justice work easier for those of us that might not have those particular gifts.
I love that, because again, I think there has been a sense too, when we're like proclaiming for justice, it's the marches and do you know what I mean? And that way.
Yeah.
one way. But I think when I read that, it was like, no, writing pen in the darkness, and what you're saying,
Yeah.
music, and what we have in our hand, what we can offer ourselves, is a way toward peace. Right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes we thought it's one way, and that's the only way to get
Right.
noticed
Right.
or our point across, because
Right.
that's what people are doing, right? That's
Right.
what's getting in the news. But
Right.
what I'm hearing is, I love it. It's a meal with a person to
It
have
is.
conversation, to listen on how maybe we can come to some understanding on how we see each other and how we see the world one on one. And you're right, it could be a song that someone's listening to on the subway and goes,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, for the first time
Yeah.
I just heard that truth, and I never thought of it that way. Because they
Yeah.
wouldn't go to a church, but they would listen to a song on
Yes.
Spotify. I'm just saying, what I mean?
Yes.
Like, it's, and I think that was a powerful reminder when I read that. I was like, oh, because she goes, it's not just walking the paved streets in freedom. It's these different ways on how we are peacemakers. It was powerful. And again, reminder for me, it's like, okay, there are many ways, and many ways I can encourage my friends in what they do and have, and are
Right.
so many artistic that can work toward peace in that space.
And let me say this too, folks, because this is important for me. When I think about, think about my introduction in the book. Basically, I'm calling the women of color to lead, right? And so I've been leading all of my life, like since I was. It is my spiritual gift, right? And most of the time, when I'm in public spaces, in outside of Christian world, most of that has been among male-dominated environments. And so getting into the church and doing more public ministry, I find that I'm often having to convince women that give them permission to lead, and or they don't see the important work that they're doing as leadership. And I'm beating the drum over and over to say to these women to fix their mouths in their hearts, in their minds, to know that the good work they are doing to advance the kingdom of God, if that's raising children, if that's providing meals, if that's being a caretaker, if that's being a pastor, if that's being a teacher, if that's being a mentor or coach, a community leader, an elder in your church, and I'm saying that like a mother of the church, or like a woman who's wise or older in years, a good aunt. All these various ways, we are leading. We are leading, and I want to. I'm a little tired of trying to convince women of that, but I think it's important, and we really need to say that, and we need to be pointing women to the women in the Bible that have led in various ways, because there is no one way to lead. Yes, some of us have more public or prophetic giftedness in ministries, but that doesn't mean that the other ways that we lead are any less important or valuable when we think about how Paul talks about the body working together, each part doing its work. And so when I think about movements, right? Like, movements do not happen, not successful ones or sustainable ones. I think about the civil rights movement. Apart from women frying chicken and wrapping it in aluminum foil and putting it, giving it to folks. Apart from women, printing out flyers in the basement of churches. Like, apart from domestic women, saying, I'm not going to get on the bus, I'm going to walk. Like, those movements don't happen without women. Apart from women giving to the church. Apart from women ushering and serving communion and leading children's ministry and leading the prayer, ministry. Like, churches don't work in the world without the leadership of women.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And so I want women to understand that. I want them to walk in their God-given, God-ordained image-bearedness to exercise their dominion on this earth as the leaders that God has created them to be. And that's part of the what we get to see embodied through the product that is this book, but it's also as a source of inspiration and encouragement for them to whatever it is that you're called to, however it is. If you just like being hospitable and cooking and that's your thing, be the best at that. serve your feast, set your table, and lead your community in important conversations that will make a difference, right? That's what I want women to know about themselves and how God sees them.
Yes. And that needs to be said. And I love that. I mean, the hard years for me, being a young woman, Filipino, with strong communication and leadership, my whole life has been, it's been hard. And only through, yes, there were many women that mentored me and helped me, but there were also men
Absolutely.
who risked jobs who said, Mal, I want you on platform, and they were hauled in front of their board. They said, why did you allow her on platform? It's like, because she had a message, the scripture, from her perspective that was I'd never heard of, and I wanted her to share it on platform at our church. One of the pastors who let me do that got hauled in front of the board and almost lost his job. And he goes, it's greater. He goes, I don't care, because that was what I believe Melinda, it was given from God, her thought about this passage, how she shared it. And I remember when I got up, Natasha, 5 men got straight up and walked right out of the sanctuary. And there was this weird feeling in the sanctuary. And then, and I was terrified, but I felt this is what I needed to do. I needed to share this message. Haggai. And afterwards, 5 girls from university who were visiting came up to me and said, this is the first time we've ever seen a woman speak in a church out of the Bible, sharing her thought on it. And they actually said to me, these are university girls, is that possible? Is it okay? I said, it is. They were like, we have never heard a sermon like that. It was one of the most powerful sermons. And it wasn't about me. They just said we'd never heard that perspective. And so
that's right.
It's been that. Even just in leading in the nonprofits I've been in churches, and then being a divorced woman. My husband left me 15 years ago, and add that on. And it was like, and I remember clearly God just saying, and I'm with you.
Amen.
Let's just go do it. And I said, but he's like, go do it. And I was like, and every time I would, fear and trembling, there were moments. And yet every time afterwards, Natasha, it was like, oh, I know why I did this. It was like God moved in amazing ways. People were like, I had no idea. Women were empowered to do. It was, so I've always gone with fear and grace and trembling and power and all the things mixed up, being with God in all that I've done, and here I am. And it's a story where you just kind of go, even for me personally, it's incredible. But when you go with God and you've got really good community, you can. And it hasn't been easy. Definitely not easy. Things have been said about me, but I just continue to go ahead, forge ahead. So, okay, one last thing. This is the part with the book. It's the chapter on why women wail, by Patricia. And I read this part in page 19. Leader, we will wail for being called victimizers when we speak up about all that has victimized us, and people his faithful love endures forever. And the leader says we will wail for having to laugh when nothing was funny, and cry when nobody cared, and explain when the obvious was clear, and people his faithful love endures forever. And we will wail to a God who promises to see us, hear us, walk with us, and go before us. People his faithful love endures forever. And the leader, we wail, knowing God listens, even if others won't. His faithful love endures forever. Thus in him we wail. So nobody can ever say we didn't trust God to turn it around. It's
no.
Yes.
I love that woman. She's one of our elders, and so one of the other ways we have diversity on the project is there's generational diversity, which is very intentional. And so she's one of the mothers. I call her Queen Mother. She's one of the mothers on the project, and she's been a dear, a wise sage, a writing mentor for me for many years. I love her dearly, and she's a child of the civil rights movement. I just had a conversation with her yesterday. So you think about Emmett Till. She was a child when Emmett Till was murdered. She was a child when the 4 girls got bombed at the Birmingham jail. I mean, at the Birmingham church in Alabama. And so this is her. So when we talk about these things, these are not stories to her. This is her life.
Yeah.
Like this is a woman who couldn't swim in a pool because she was black. As a child growing up in a community pool. And so, again, going to the narrative and how Pharaoh has power to craft narratives, they're lazy. And so she's making this public proclamation that is it's a powerful liturgy, but that last statement to me is and I've read it multiple times over the past few months at these events. We wail so that no one could ever say. The lie would be they're not really Christians, right? They don't believe God. Why don't you just trust God? We wail. The truth is, the reason we raise our voice, the reason we raise our voices in lament, the reason we wail is so that no one could ever say that we didn't trust God to turn it around.
Oh, wow.
That's the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Natasha, thank you for this collaboration, this gift. Everybody should have this on their shelf.
Amen.
Let me end with this. Back to Natasha Morrison. This book is for anyone who is broken, longing for justice, and trusting that Jesus is a rock in a weary land.
Yeah, he is.
Jesus is a rock in our weary land. These insights in this book invite you to feast, fellowship, listen, and learn at the table of the marginalized. And when you read the powerful words of these women of faith and witness how God leads and uplifts the blameless no matter how the systemic structures seek to weigh us down, our cries of lament are also cries of strength and resolve as we continue on the journey of justice. For you to pursue justice, you must first have eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart to understand injustice. To the women of color, I love us, and let us rejoice that voices of lament. Natasha, this book, your book, shows our love for us. I'm like emotional. It powerful. So grateful for it. Last thoughts, Natasha? Your hope for this, or did getting this book together, how did it change you? You learned through it. Just some final thoughts as we go.
Yeah, I'm humbled by it. I'm thankful for the women that have entrusted me with their stories. I'm thankful for the God who is faithful. I do trust them to turn it around. And I think our eyes have not seen yet, or our ears have not heard yet. It has not entered yet into our heart what Jesus has prepared for us. And that's the hope I want to keep before us.
That's good. Yeah. I hope you do another one, something else. We'll see. But
so I've been told.
You're like, let me just revel in this one, please, and then we'll move on to the next. But thank you, Natasha. I loved this conversation. It was really beautiful to be with you together, just sharing through it. So thank you for the great work that you're doing, your voice, and keep encouraging women, to lead. I think it's the same thing. I speak at a lot of women's conferences, and I think helping women understand they can lead in any place that they are, but there's others where I'm like, you need to have courage to step up. For some of these women, like, it's time. Let's go. So keep speaking that, and thank you. Merry Christmas to you.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's hard for me to say have a great 2023 because I said that last year. Let's have a great 2022, and what a year it's been. So anyway, I do pray. Bless you in the new year, and as God continues to show you your sort of direction and where to go. And thank you so much for your voice. It was a really beautiful conversation about peace and hope and lament and encouragement. So thank you.
God bless you, sis. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And to you, our listeners and viewers, as an encouragement for you today, as I always end each show, know that you are seen, you are heard, and you're deeply loved by God. Thank you for joining us. I'm here in my hometown of Burlington, Ontario, hanging out downtown in our village square. And as I walk these cobblestone streets, I realize that it has taken a village to ensure that See Hear Love's mission and vision is shared across Canada, around the world, that you are seen, heard, and deeply loved by God.
As a body of Christ, there is hope for us to grow and reconstruct together.
We couldn't do this work without you sharing life-changing stories of what Jesus is doing in people's lives, stories of hope and freedom and healing in areas that matter to me and to you.
I want to have the faith to believe that His plan is good, even when it's taking that detour that I don't really understand.
We have so much more to do and so many more people to reach with the life-changing message of Jesus. For a monthly donation of $25 or more, you can help us do just that. And we'll send you a special thank you gift of our favorite things. Go to seehearlove.com/give or call 1-800-265-3100 and join our See Hear Love Village today.